Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our last event in the series entitled All Change Here, Pandemics and Transformation.
My name is Jamal Callaway. I'm in THRS, Theology and Religious Studies. I'm a modern theologian. I do systematic theology, philosophy of religion and literature, primarily Black American literature, 20th century novels, poetry, theater, so forth. And this is my beginning of my third year here, I believe. So I'm going to do something actually a little different from what I usually do. I'm gonna go a little classical today. I'm gonna be talking about St. Paul and Martin Luther in regards to the pandemic. So I'll just share my screen. I'm also terrible at PowerPoint, so you will see how badly I am. I just don't have that skill. All right, faith in the pandemic. Let me begin by saying, so as a theologian and scholar of religion, this particular moment, or more so in March and April, this moment of the pandemic was particularly difficult for me when all of the different stay-at-home orders came out, because it seemed that the communities that gave the most trouble when it came to stay-at-home orders and social distancing were the religious congregations. So news outlet after news outlet reported on the different ministries and clergy and pastors who refused to close their religious doors because they believed that God would protect them. Now, a part of me kind of wanted to roll my eyes at that, but that just sort of goes against, my training as a scholar and theologian. But the other part of me wanted to take their notions of faith seriously. I wanted to question, what did they mean by that? I wanted to know more about their religious confidence, especially as someone who studies religion within the parameters of racial and ethnic oppression. Therefore, my question is, what does it mean to have faith in God during a pandemic? And this brought me to both literature and philosophy, but in particular, it brought me to a famous letter written by Martin Luther. This is one of the news outlets that talked about a religious community in Texas opened up in social distancing in spite of the sort of stay-at-home orders. But let's be sort of back up to give context. In the summer of 1527, what's known as the Black Plague, but I'll just call it the plague, swept through Europe, in a Europe that was still dealing or in the midst of dealing or coping with the effects of the Protestant Reformations. Contextually, the Protestant Reformations created a sort of theological insecurity or theological insecurities. And what I mean is, Germans in particular were still struggling with if they were taught inaccurate responses to things, or if this new form of understanding Christendom was a terrible intrusion into their theological universe. According to theologian David Fink, Protestants regarded the plague as God's judgment on Catholic decadence and idolatry. Catholics accused Protestants of weakening the unity of Christendom in a time of crisis. Both sides gleefully seized on examples of cowardice and other missteps to paint their enemies in the worst possible light, end quote. However, when the plague did strike the northern part of Germany, hit in Wittenberg, the Elector John of Saxony ordered Luther and other faculty members on top of their families to leave the city and retreat to social distancing in Jena. But oddly enough, Martin Luther refused to leave. Luther stayed in Wittenberg to care for the sick and the dying. He continued preaching. He continued administering the sacraments. He visited people who were sick inside of their homes, and he decided to, provide pastoral care. He even turned his house or his home into some sort of, not his home, a monastery, into a sort of makeshift hospital. But this wasn't done without criticism. Luther was vastly criticized for being reckless, inconsiderate, selfish, self-righteous, amongst a host of other things. So in a response to these criticisms, framed in a sort of Pauline epistle, Luther offers a sort of vindication for himself that highlights how he believes faith in God should function amidst a plague, or what we call a pandemic. But his letter has to be understood in the context of the Pauline Luther tradition, which includes an entire understanding of their philosophy of history, or what we call an understanding of their notions of salvation. That means that a plague or a pandemic has to be understood in a medieval world, in a pre-Enlightenment world, a world of theological magic, gods and devils, angels and demons, a world where everything does in fact happen for a reason. A pandemic is not just a spontaneous or mysterious biological virus that ravages through the world. It is the consequence of the devil's hands, hands that move with or through the approval of God. Secondly, pandemics and plagues are related to the category of death. In other words, pandemics, fires, wars are all under the same umbrella. According to Luther, the fires in California, Oregon, and Washington, and the coronavirus itself are pretty much tethered to one another. They are, in fact, in many ways the same thing, meaning they are merely the consequences of Adam's disobedience. So again, allow me to back up and talk about Paul's perspective of salvation, sin, and death. According to theologian and Hegelian scholar Peter C. Hodgson, Christianity and Judaism provide a coherent, meaningful salvation history. Both religions' salvation history offers its adherents historical coherence, a religious narrative that ties all the arbitrary chronicle of events in life together into a meaningful story that fulfills their deepest longings and answers their eternal questions. In terms of the Christian narrative specifically, through Hebraic scriptures, St. Paul, the architect of institutional Christianity, states in letter after letter that God created the world good and morally unblemished and spiritually intertwined until Adam and Eve defied God, until they obeyed the advice from the serpent and devoured fruit from the forbidden tree. Through such lofty disobedience and curiosity, sin entered into the world. God reprimanded Adam and Eve with a list of different punishments, but ultimately, together, they were punished with the notorious experience of death. After centuries of struggling with multiple forms of human-to-human domination, enslavement, and cultural persecution, Jesus, the Anointed, as God incarnate, was birthed into the world sinless in order to proclaim the message of God and die a brutal public death at the hands of Roman authority. After Jesus' death, he reappeared to his followers, and if this reappearance, this resurrection, was believed and believed in, then its followers were given salvation, a promise from God that they would receive eternal life, reconnecting with the Spirit and thus correcting this punishment of death. This salvation history forwarded by Paul begins with Adam. And I'm interested in not just how Paul reads and interprets Genesis at large. My focus centers on how Paul uses Adam. I'm interested specifically in what Adam signifies in Paul's theology about death, especially in relation to a plague or pandemic. For Paul, Adam operates as a symbol of inevitable death and separation from God. What I mean is, more pressingly for Paul, humanity, through Adam's disobedience, descends into the world of nature. And to become an object in the natural world inherently means that one is also conflated with death. Adam represents death and failing before the law, before the appearance of the law, and the Anointed One, who was Christ, represents faith. And faith, according to Paul, is the knowledge and acceptance of the reversal of the punishment of death. Christ represents both justification and justice, but for Paul, faith in a new world, a new life, is a new arrangement that eradicates the current order of existence. I'll say it differently. For Paul, the fall of humanity means the fall into the vagaries of nature. That's why Paul writes, if there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, and the second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth, and as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. So Christ basically fixes or corrects the punishment of being an earthly human being. But in regards to Luther, faith is about the acceptance of grace in the reversal of the punishment of death. But once one accepts Jesus the Anointed and believes, death is then understood as like a sort of portal or gateway to God. One is, in other words, one's death is intercepted by God. But if death is simply a portal to God, then the question that is posed to Luther is whether or not it is sinful to flee from the plague, or should one stay and accept the consequences of being earthly? In other words, to modernize the question for fun, the question is it wrong or sinful to flee or social distance? That is why Luther starts his letter by saying, to begin with, some people are of the firm opinion that one need not and should not run away from a deadly plague. Rather, since death is God's punishment, which he sends upon us for our sins, we must submit to God and with a true and firm faith patiently await our punishment. They look upon running away as an outright wrong and as a lack of belief in God. Others take the position that one may properly flee, particularly if one holds no public office. I cannot censor the former of their excellent decision. They uphold a good cause, namely a strong faith in God, and deserve commendation because they desire every Christian to hold to a strong, firm faith. For Luther, one can flee, but also one can flee wrongfully. Meaning, if one has to deny God or deny Christ in order to flee for their safety, then it is sinful. Secondly, it is wrong to flee a community if you are clergy and the community needs you. However, when there are enough clergy or enough ministers or priests available, then it is okay for a clergy person to leave. Luther also believes that if one is in public office, then they are not allowed or they should not leave town because leaving will expose the community to all sorts of political danger. And this touches on the fact that both Paul and Luther, or Luther believes, because Paul believes that all officials, all leaders of a community, all members of a governance or a governing body are in that position because of God. Secondly, or moreover, it is wrong for parents to flee from children. Luther also says it is wrong for servants to flee from their masters. Overall, to Luther, fleeing from death is not necessarily sinful in itself because death is death no matter how it occurs. According to scripture, Luther says that God sent 4 scourges: pestilence, famine, sword, and wild beasts. So if it is okay to flee, for example, a lion, then it's also okay to flee from plague. Luther concedes all of these reasons that people can flee, but he takes a long route to get to this one key point that I want to highlight. Luther says, if it be God's will that evil come upon us and destroy us, none of our precautions will help us. I'm going to anecdotally state, so for Luther, if God, or better, it's better to say, in Luther's theology, it is possible to conceive of God enacting evil or allowing evil upon human beings. But here's where it gets tricky and specific for Luther. According to Luther, fleeing or even social distancing is wrong if it's predicated on self-protection at the expense of trying to heal others who are suffering from an illness. Luther writes, in the same way we must and we owe it to our neighbor to accord him the same treatment in other troubles and perils. If his house is on fire, love compels me to run to help him to extinguish the flames. Luther argues that if a deadly epidemic strikes, we need to remain where we are in order to make, let me say it differently. Luther argues that if a deadly epidemic strikes, we need to remain where we are, make our preparations, and take courage of the fact that we are mutually bound together and all suffer from the consequence of Adam's disobedience. Deserting one another is, according to Luther, in continuity with the disobedience of the first human beings. And staying and helping is our way of mimicking the second Adam, the divine person known as Jesus the Anointed. And I'll put it this way: fleeing or social distancing ought to be an option if that fleeing or social distancing is in service to other human beings. If I socially distance to help heal the community, then I'm doing God's will. But if I'm merely social distancing because I'm simply scared of catching this plague or this virus and I don't want to die, then we are, in the words of Luther, murderers or accomplices to murder. In other words, faith as a practice can be corrupted into doing what Luther calls tempting God. Meaning, if a person disdains medicine, disdains social distancing, attends church and other social happenings without taking the necessary precautions, they are in fact helping the devil sustain the punishment of death for neighbors and people who are trying to possibly do God's will. Luther says, those that say it's God's punishment, and if God wants to protect us, he can do so without medicines or carefulness, those people are tempting God. God has, according to Luther, created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health, end quote. Luther continues, if one makes no use of intelligence or medicine, when he could do so without detriment to his neighbor, such a person enters his body and must beware lest he become trouble in God's eyes. In other words, Luther writes, act like a person who wants to help put out a fire or a burning city. In terms of God and having faith in God for Luther's theology, it appears that he is saying that the plague is a consequence of living in the natural world and being a natural subject. In the world of nature, plagues and fires are accidents of the devil, and these accidents or random moments of pain are to be coped with in community. And there are right and wrong ways to do right and wrong things in community. Unfortunately, for Luther's theology, God is not particularly sensitive to these events. In fact, it is possible to tick God off even more, according to Luther. And from Luther's perspective, it seems that that is what some of the American churches were doing that I was referring to when I first started this lecture.
Introduce our next speaker, Dr. Michael Kelly, who is an associate professor of philosophy. Dr. Kelly did his graduate work at Fordham University, culminating with a PhD in philosophy. He taught at Boston College from 2004 to 2012, and then joined our Department of Philosophy. Dr. Kelly's main area of research is 20th century continental philosophy, especially phenomenology, from its classical to its contemporary period. Dr. Kelly's research publications and presentations have covered such topics as the relation between time consciousness, intentionality, and self-awareness, and most recently, some phenomenological distinctions between envy and sibling emotions, such as covetousness and emulation. He also has a current interest in applications of classical phenomenology on the so-called negative emotions and those virtues that may help one overcome one's negative emotions, envy and gratitude, for example. Dr. Kelly has published extensively. In addition to the 4 books that he has published since 2010, he has an edited collection in the press forthcoming from Bloomsbury entitled Michel Henry's Practical. And he's also completing a monograph entitled tentatively A Phenomenological Account of Envy and Its Neighbors. Dr. Kelly enjoys teaching introductory level philosophy courses such as human nature and ethics, and specialized classes in both the history of continental thought and certain themes such as time consciousness and subjective life, and emotion studies and moral phenomenology. Dr. Kelly will be speaking this afternoon on Petrarch's coping with the Black Plague and some good and not so good unintended consequences for Western culture. Okay, thank you.
Though I am not a Petrarch scholar and have painted in fairly broad strokes here, I'm going to read a paper, and I apologize in advance for that. The other thing I wanted to say is that I kind of I think I might have mistaken the amount of time I have, and my paper reads at about 28 minutes. It's a bit long. So, born in 1304 in Arezzo, Italy, Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, lived through pestilent times with plenty of social contaminants and natural contagions. From 1309 to 1377, the heart of the Roman Catholic Church was uprooted and relocated to Avignon, France. This event, often referred to as the Babylonian captivity, perhaps because of Petrarch as much as Luther, created cracks in the cultural foundation of the Western world. Constructing the papal palace in Avignon placed a large financial burden on the laity and prompted questions about spiritual hypocrisy among church leadership. In a passage that reflected a growing sense of on the continent that the church was losing its piety, Petrarch was strong in his protest, expressing an objection that would become a major refrain in the Reformation's period of Christianity. He writes, quote, "Now I am living in France, the Babylon of the West. The sun in its travels sees nothing more hideous. Here reign the successors of the poor fishermen of Galilee. They have strangely forgotten their origin. I'm astounded to see these men loaded with gold and clad in purple, boasting of spoils and princes and nations. Instead of holy solitude, we find a criminal host and crowds of the most infamous satellites. Instead of soberness, licentious banquets. Instead of pious pilgrimage, preternatural and foul sloth," close quote. The sun, along with Petrarch, soon would see more hideous natural sights. The 1340 plague ravaged Tuscany, and during the 1348 Black Death, Petrarch lost many very close and dear loved ones, a brother and a lover among them. A tendency existed among Catholics of the time to view the plague as a divine punishment for the sinful ways of man. Petrarch was not so sure, but he felt the anguish of the pestilent times acutely, and he held in contempt the French papacy's lavishness, its material opportunism, and its unwillingness or inability to prioritize the spiritual needs of its congregation. Petrarch would not live to see the end of this Babylonian captivity and the spiritual pestilence on the church as he saw it. He died in 1374, but not of the plague, and not before being deemed by no less an authority than his friend and contemporary Giovanni Boccaccio, the restorer of the study of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, that is to say, not before being deemed the founder of the Studia Humanitas, that is, and then here arguably, not before being deemed the founder of Renaissance humanism. Such was the unintended consequence of how Petrarch faced the pestilence of his time. Petrarch lived those pestilent days during the Black Plague in despair, in constant grief over the death of his loved ones, in constant fear that his life or the life of those closest to him would be the next to expire at any moment. Indeed, these were days when, for Petrarch, the eschatological promise provided him inadequate peace or tranquility of mind. Petrarch, the Roman Catholic, found little in the religion of his day to help him cope with many frequent and intense upheavals of emotion caused by the plague. His angst during the Black Plague motivated a need for a coherent intellectual manner of coping that would enable him to unite his faith with his humanism. Petrarch thus would turn to reading, studying, imitating, and internalizing the behavior of ancients who demonstrated a certain depth of soul that could help him address the most urgent problems of his days. From history's retrospective glance, how Petrarch faced the plague would also be how he unintentionally founded the Studia Humanitas. In what follows, I want to reflect on why Petrarch might have turned to secular rather than religious counsel to face the Black Death, how he used the writings of Greek and Roman thinkers to face it, and what we might identify as some of the good and not so good unintended consequences of how he faced it. All of this requires first a review of the background and a sketch of Renaissance humanism. Section 1, Petrarch, Renaissance Humanism, and Remedies. According to Renaissance scholar Charles Trinkas, Renaissance humanists aimed to arrive at a definition of nature, of the nature, condition, and destiny of man within the inherited framework of the Christian faith. Petrarch himself was convinced that in certain respects and important respects, antique rhetoric, poetry, history, and philosophy were not in conflict with Christianity, but could actually strengthen religion. For Renaissance humanists, human dignity was found not only in the human nature as created imago Dei, but also frequently tied to free will and its active exercise. On the one hand, such a view of human dignity, according to the Renaissance humanists, did not always rest easily alongside a Christian tradition emphasizing the priority of God's will and an almost ascetic withdrawal from the world. On the other hand, the trope of human dignity could and was used to make sense both of the flourishing human creative energy and the human being's capacity for spiritual elevation, the superiority of which Petrarch and his comrades always upheld. The zeitgeist called for renewed piety and increased self-determination or autonomy. And we see both in what was Petrarch's most popular work during his lifetime and for many years after, Remedies for Fortune Fair and Foul, or Remedies for Good and Bad Fortune, which is a 2-volume compendium of counsel. Facing pestilences both spiritual and natural, Petrarch is concerned to limit good and bad fortune's corrupting influences, subordinating fortune to the calm that comes from wise and reasoned counsel. His aim is not to instruct the reader toward any securement of any external outcome, but to remedy the self and to help it find spiritual peace. A closer look at how Petrarch and Renaissance humanists understood fortune and how to respond to it without resignation, but instead with self-determination, may further illuminate the novelty of Petrarch's contribution and any transformations of faith that may be at stake in his work. At the time Petrarch is writing, a long line of debate in Western culture, from Livy to Cicero to Boethius to Petrarch and others, existed regarding fortune or fortuna. Cicero viewed fortune as a good goddess who would bestow her greatest gifts of worldly glory, honor, and wealth on those who persuaded her to do so. The power of persuasion amounted to a kind of seduction, according to Cicero, for it was thought that she would respond favorably to vir, or manliness, manifest primarily through the virtues of magnanimity, fortitude, courage, and honesty. But whereas Lady Fortune may have responded well to the Roman male's powers of persuasion, she did not appear a potential ally for early Christian philosophers such as Boethius. For Boethius, Lady Fortune was an unforgiving force indifferent to human mundane welfare with respect to worldly goods, such as glory, honor, and wealth, or goods of the body and social and material world that Christian authorities, such as Augustine, Aquinas, would also relegate below or beneath the higher goods of the soul, or spiritual goods. In fact, in his Consolations of Philosophy, Boethius noted that Lady Fortune's role consisted in reminding humans of the ultimate worthlessness of worldly and social material goods, delivering such reminders by capriciously bestowing and reclaiming temporal accessories to the happy life. An agent of God, according to Boethius, Lady Fortune guides humans away from unstable and temporal worldly glory towards stable and eternal heavenly glory, wherein one finds one's true dignity. A trope that is present 8 centuries later when Dante's Divine Comedy discusses human happiness and dignity by focusing on the end goal of life, namely beatitude, as represented by Beatrice above the sphere of time and change. If Cicero advocated self-determining fortune and Boethius advocated spiritually retiring from the world, or at least strict subordination of worldly interests to spiritual interests, Petrarch suggested remedies for good and bad fortune during the time of the Black Death amount to a curious mix of both. Of Fortuna, Petrarch writes, quote, "One should believe nothing. She is false, inconstant, and untrustworthy. Despise her when she promises as well as when she denies. Scorn her when she gives or takes away," close quote. Petrarch seems to retain something like Boethius's view of Lady Fortune as a pitiless force, but ultimately he does not, for he does not endorse any suspicious view of fortune as a special force in the universe. In the preface to the second part of Remedies, Petrarch specifies, quote, "Nor should the word fortune bother you, which occurs not only in the title but throughout the work. You have often heard what I think of fortune, yet I believe it necessary, particularly for those less given to learning, that I use a simple word that is familiar to them, although I am not unaware of what others have said about fortune. Most succinctly Jerome, where he writes, 'There is no fate and no fortune.' Thus the common crowd will recognize their own way of speaking, and the learned, who are very scarce, will understand what I mean and will not be disturbed by my colloquial usage," close quote. In addition to appearing to follow Boethius's line on Lady Fortune, but not, he does seem to present a largely reactive account of our relation to fortune. He notes that we should despise and scorn as reactions to her actions. But this is really also not an appropriate way to understand Petrarch in this case. And this appears clearly in Petrarch's, or a correction to this understanding would appear clearly in Petrarch's alteration of another popular representation of fortune during his time. Up to Petrarch's time, Fortuna was often depicted as a wheel to which men are bound and flung either to the top or the bottom of its revolution, depending on whim. Renaissance humanists preferred to represent Fortuna as a boat navigating treacherous waters with man himself at the helm. Petrarch understands fortune as more boat than wheel. Quote, "Lacking a rudder, the ship of our soul is driven on the sea of this life by waves of events and winds of temptation. Nowhere is there a port where hope used to direct us, nor a heaven which hope used to show us, but the sea is on all sides, as Virgil says, whence come shipwrecks and storms," close quote. Petrarch is suggesting here that human dignity in this life, in his pestilent times, rests neither solely nor primarily in the immortal soul and salvation in the afterlife, where Boethius, Augustine, Aquinas, and Dante may have located it, nor in glory, honor, and riches as Cicero may have it. Instead, Petrarch located human dignity in man's activity, his freedom and self-determining search for calmer waters. He would adopt a Ciceroian model, but not Ciceroian ends. He found Aegir's for the ship of his soul and the historical figures Cicero put forth as moral exemplars who faced misfortune with magnanimity and courage. But through Cicero's moral exemplars, Petrarch himself sought peace for this life, spiritual goods of the soul rather than social and material goods. Petrarch develops a more self-determining Christian, believing in the next life still, but anxious to improve the quality of this life here and now. There is thus a distinct this-worldly cast to Petrarch's meditations on how to face the Black Plague. A reader of Petrarch's writing senses a tension in Petrarch between the classical and medieval worlds, between the secular and the sacred, this worldly and the heavenly world. As my undergraduate teacher, Robert Proctor, explained this tension of which Petrarch himself was not unaware, quote, "While Dante reserved his greatest efforts of the mind and pen for portraying the finish, Petrarch poured all of his emotional and creative energy into surviving the race here below," close quote. Section 2, words without end. Though he embraced the Christian view of the cosmos and was familiar with Augustine's, Aquinas', and Dante's exhortations to transcend the temporal world of contingent beings and material and social goods, Petrarch's obsession with dying and death during the Black Plague would not allow him to turn his attention from the realm of time and change to the realm of eternity and stasis. Believing in the afterlife, he nevertheless sought peace in this life. Unsatisfied with awaiting the beatific vision during these pestilent times, Petrarch sometimes expresses doubt about the afterlife. Quote, "After we cease to exist, what will become of us?" Close quote. But such worries were much less frequent than his often moving reflections that betrayed despair over the inadequately consoling belief that ultimate relief from his sufferings would come in the afterlife. Such lamentations, however, never created a crisis of faith for Petrarch. In fact, Petrarch's writings barely entertain explanations of the Black Death as God's divine punishment. He thus does not slide down that slippery slope into the so-called problem of evil that often shakes believers and emboldens non-believers to challenge God's existence or nature. In a brief consideration of the plague as divine punishment, Petrarch concludes that God has not forsaken human beings. He writes, quote, "Is it not true that your clemency, God, exhausted little by human crimes, angrily turns the eyes of your mercy away from us? Or perhaps it is true what certain great minds suspect, that God does not care about mortal things. But let this madness be absent from our minds. If you did not care, they would not exist. Certainly you care about us and our affairs, but it is for a hidden reason unknown to us. why we are seen as most worthy of all ages to be punished fiercely by a justice which is not diminished because it is hidden. For the depth of your judgment is inscrutable and accessible to human senses. Thus we are either truly the worst of all, which I would like to deny more than I dare, or we are being saved for future blessings, or else there is something which we are unable to think at all, close quote. Having acknowledged his finitude and the limits of his reason and cognition to penetrate this tragic period in human history, rather than abandon his faith, Petrarch appears closer to the authors of the book of Job than he does to Job's friends or even Job himself. But seeking consolation from grief and anxiety in this life, Petrarch does not turn to spiritual guidance offered by Scripture or Christ as the moral exemplar par excellence. The guidance from, for example, Matthew chapter 6, which urges us against grief and worry and anxiety by reminding us of the lilies in the field, and that, quote, tomorrow will take care of itself, close quote, for those who seek first the kingdom of God, does not pacify Petrarch as he attempts to find peace in this life. Petrarch turned his attention to questions about how one lives this life in the midst of misfortune and pestilence without exclusively deferring human welfare or forgetting the humanist notion of human dignity. Why would he take this move? Why appeal to classics rather than Christian moral exemplars? Perhaps Petrarch found empty platitudes and disingenuousness on the side of the religious life outside of the academy in the Babylon of the West, and empty intellectualism on the side of religious life within the academy. Perhaps, too, would be that imitation of moral exemplars from classics, those characters of self-determining action, proved more appealing than the spiritual resignation one might find in Christian moral exemplars. Robert Proctor's proposed explanation for Petrarch's turn to the classics rather than Christian counsel holds that the religious teachings of Petrarch's time are of little use to him in his daily emotional life during the Black Death. As Proctor writes, quote, there was nothing in the religious culture of his time which would have enabled him to find meaning in all of the unexpected deaths he saw around him without rising above them in contemplation, close quote. Petrarch's inability to find consolation in the religion of his time may have had something to do with the scholastic theology of his day, which he and his comrades believed neglected the very issue of faith in his efforts towards a renewed spiritual piety that theology supposedly was meant to illuminate. Renaissance humanists, and Petrarch most among them, encouraged a shifting in the theological heft of the culture away from the scholastic heritage that, in the words of my friend and colleague Jeff Hansen, was now considered bloated with jargon and tedious and irrelevant logic chopping divorced from spiritual well-being. In his letters to family 10 and 16, Petrarch criticized the theologians of his time as quote-unquote dialecticians, by which he meant scholars of religion and professors of theology who were increasingly preoccupied with nominalism and the technique and rules for logical and linguistic analysis. Fascination with these techniques of reason to understand God were both wholly worldly and wholly spiritually arid, according to Petrarch. Words without end, we might say. God talk in the mode of highly technical, logical, and linguistic analysis of propositions and sentences became increasingly distinct from the referent and wholly devoid of spirituality in the talk of the good life and human welfare. And in place of that arid scholasticism of 14th century academic theology, Petrarch and company comprised a fervent scholarly class that held tightly to the Christian faith, but sought in the classics the basis for a revivification of that faith. The humanist interest in ancient rhetoric for then we might say was what we might now call existential, and as much as they searched for the means by which to persuade and exhort their audience to a rededicated piety. Intensely religious, Petrarch and his fellow Renaissance humanists spurned scholastic theology and sought to redeploy rhetorical and communicative power of the classics in the service of building up a lay spirituality with genuine vigor and conciliatory power. Along the way, of course, as I've said, unintentionally founding the Studia Humanitas. Section 3, words with an end. Petrarch, Humanities, and particular remedies. In the work that I mentioned earlier on remedies in good and bad fortune, Petrarch's treatment for enduring well the misfortunes of his pestilent times emphasized the reading of Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, particularly its sections on bearing pain, which examined notable Roman figures who aptly illustrated the topic. Petrarch recommended such texts to himself and others because he believed that, quote, words heal the maladies of soul, the health of which certainly either destroys or mitigates pain in the body, close quote. And he believed that reading about the lives of these noble characters allowed one to measure the strength of one's soul against them. In a particularly striking case of Petrarch's use of Cicero's Tusculan disputations, Petrarch examines the case of Caius Marius, a notable Roman citizen who refused to be tied down before undergoing surgery to move varicose veins in his legs. This is an important moment to illustrate in Cicero and Petrarch's writings, for it concerns the virtue of fortitude exemplified by Marius physically and publicly, and sought by Petrarch psychologically and privately to endure the emotional upheavals of the plague. As Cicero tells the story, Marius, quote, bore his pain as a man, ver, and as a human being, homo, close quote. And his actions of self-mastery exemplify that, according to Cicero, quote, what most befits patience, fortitude, and greatness of soul, not only curbs the soul, but even in a certain way makes pain milder, close quote. Cicero holds Marius up for imitation because Marius exemplifies ver, manliness or fortitude, a cardinal virtue in Roman society that went rewarded with glory and honor. Whereas Cicero's Marius bore his pain as a man and as a human, Petrarch claimed that this, quote, brave and steadfast man encouraged others to imitate him, close quote. And his example had power because, quote, before Marius, it was believed that pain in the body could not be overcome by strength in the soul, close quote. As Proctor insightfully recognizes, however, Petrarch distorts the social nature of Marius's act by construing its significance as one of the inner struggle between pain in the body and strength in the soul. For Cicero, who never mentions strength of soul when discussing Marius did not create ver, he merely demonstrated, quote, another way of being a true Roman, close quote. Indeed, for Roman society, the intelligibility of an appreciation for Marius's act followed from its being a manifestation in a particular species, homo, of a particular transpersonal virtue, ver, which was cherished in the Roman community of Cicero's time. While Petrarch certainly discusses the deed done by Marius, his account renders the virtue of the deed secondary to the particular self-determining activity of the agent himself. Petrarch's retelling of the story endows Marius with a striking degree of autonomy. If, according to Petrarch, such a brave and steadfast man encouraged others to imitate him, then Petrarch's Marius sets a trend rather than another example to the Roman community of ver. As Proctor observes, Petrarch fails to see that future Romans imitated Marius, quote, not just because Marius had done so, but because Roman society made fortitude its cardinal virtue and rewarded with praise, glory, and fame acts of courage, close quote. Cicero's version of the story, that is, emphasizes how Marius's actions embody Roman virtue and the essence of what it meant for Romans to be a man, to have fortitude. Petrarch's version of the story emphasizes the person, a brave and steadfast man, Marius himself. Cicero's Marius highlights a desire in Roman males to embody the virtue Marius displayed in order to receive glory. Petrarch's Marius highlights a person other Romans imitated, a person, in fact, that Petrarch himself could attempt to imitate in his deepest emotional despair. Put differently, Petrarch finds value in the struggle Marius had within himself in preparing for and undergoing surgery, rather than the struggle Marius avoided by elevating himself to ver or virtue, to the expectations, that is, of his Roman society. Having shifted his focus for this life from the Christian consolation and motivated by a personal and therapeutic end, Petrarch's reading and examination of noble Romans required that he extract such noble Roman men from their communal context, governed by a public and transpersonal sense of virtue. Petrarch interiorizes virtue by subordinating it to the person's strength of soul, because he yearns to find that virtue in the deepest recesses of his self, a self that is struggling with despair during the time of the Black Death. One could, Petrarch believes, strengthen one's soul in this life by reflecting on what noble figures in the past had done and measure oneself accordingly. Petrarch would read Cicero, look into himself, fashion a compensatory image of the noble man reported by Cicero, and hope that he saw his own reflection therein, or could fashion such a fortitude if he did not. Petrarch's act of self-objectification implies not only that he experiences himself as autonomous, but also, and quite anachronistically, that famous men of antiquity whom he imitated experienced themselves as autonomous as well. Neither deferring his welfare in this life to an eschatological faith, nor abandoning his faith, Petrarch found solace in studying ancient moral exemplars and attempting to apply their courage, fortitude, and dignity to his own emotional life. Such was the value of the Studia Humanitas. Petrarch seems always to have believed that God may be humanity's final salvation, but he also believed that one must be one's own stabilizing center of the universe in this life. If Petrarch's plague-driven transformation was never an abandonment of the need for religious life or his own faith, his writings nevertheless contributed to the general late medieval trend of paying increased attention to the intellectual and political alongside the religious and eschatological. In the service of reviving spiritual life via a curious mix of idiosyncratic reading of the ancients and a preservation of faith, Petrarch ushers in the modern autonomous self, along with the introduction to the Studia Humanitas. Petrarch was a self-determining intervention that helped cultivate human dignity in the Renaissance humanist sense, brought Petrarch some peace in this life, and gave Western culture the Studia Humanitas and the incipient modern autonomous self now occupying a greater part of the center of meaning for human life. Conclusion. Untimely meditation. Renaissance scholar Charles Trinkas may wish to put my last point a bit differently. He has claimed more strongly that Renaissance humanism initiated, quote, the gradual deification of man or the displacement of the consciousness of God as the prime directive force in the universe by a notion of human powers and of natural social forces, close quote. Quite the transformation of faith that would be. Cultural anthropologist Ernst Becker, however, the author of The Denial of Death, might balk at the possibility of a full deification in Trinkas' sense. Becker's Pulitzer Prize-winning studies of anthropology, sociology, psychology, and psychiatry led him to conclude that these social sciences ultimately point to a conception of human being as a creature searching for something greater than himself. Becker writes, quote, if I were asked for the single most striking insight into the human condition, it would be this, that no one person is strong enough to support the meaning of his life unaided by something outside of himself, close quote. By which Becker meant, as he continued, more broadly put, the sacred or the religious. For Becker, if we find an increasing deification of man through the progress of Western culture, as Trinkas had put it, one initiated by Renaissance humanism, religion and faith would always remain because the social scientific questions concerning human being could only be addressed by theology and religion or reflections on the sacred. Becker may be correct in his view that the social sciences each run up against the ultimate questions that then must be handed off to theology and religion. But can these disciplines as they operate in the academy today provide adequate responses for us? Or do we return to some of Petrarch's concerns, but for different reasons? Today's academic theology, some have argued, seems to bear witness to the deification of man that Trinkas identifies. The academic study of religion and theology often trades metaphysics for post-structuralism and scriptural exegesis and counsel for historicized social sciences. Its focus on method obscures its natural end, such that we might say that its content differs from the scholasticism Petrarch criticized, but its form remains the same. Robert Proctor has put this point very polemically and argues that contemporary academic theology shackles itself to method and the deification of man. Proctor's polemic is this, quote, the academic study and teaching of religion increasingly moves away from theology and metaphysics and adopts instead the disciplines of anthropology, sociology, and psychology to describe and explain the experience of the sacred. Since their methodological perspective often requires that they explain whatever phenomena they may be studying as a human construct, these disciplines, when they do this, are incapable of considering the existence of anything which transcends the human. When their method requires that when they meet the belief in the divine, they reduce it to the product of social, cultural, or psychological factors, close quote. If Proctor is right, then in a world where academic thought leaders in theology and religion focus on method and technique at the expense of the referent, the sacred, as we saw Petrarch similarly object to the scholasticism of his times, perhaps we are not far from an answer to a question that Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben's very recent and very controversial editorial from late February 2020 which poses itself as a question now, we could say, to Becker and to us. Agamben writes, and for this he was quite highly criticized, quote, the first thing the wave of panic that has paralyzed the country of Italy obviously shows us is that our society no longer believes in anything but bare life. It is obvious that Italians are disposed to sacrifice practically everything, the normal conditions of life, social relationships, work, friendships, affections, and religious and political convictions to the danger of getting sick. Bare life and the danger of losing it is not something that unites people, but blinds and separates them. Other human beings are now seen solely as possible spreaders of the plague whom one must avoid at all costs, and from whom one needs to keep a distance of at least a meter. Our neighbor has been canceled, and it is curious that churches remain silent on the subject. What do human relationships become in a country that habituates itself to live in this way for who knows how long? And what is a society that has no value other than survival? If Agamben's remarks urge a return to Becker's aforementioned conclusion, has Trinkus nevertheless seen most precisely Petrarch's legacy as a transformation of faith into the deification of man? Now perhaps not just the deification of man, but if Agamben is right, to the deification of the bios of the anthropos. Could Petrarch's call to revive spiritual piety only be understood today according to what Theroux calls in Camus' La Peste, quote, in fact, the only problem, close quote. That is to say, as Theroux asks, can one be a saint without God? Thank you.
Did you say that before we began that you wanted to pose a question to Jamal at the top of our discussion?
No, I was just apologizing in advance for presenting this kind of broad concern about the deification of man and how it factors into some ways of practicing contemporary theology and religious studies.
Okay, well, I wanted to give you an opportunity to begin with that, if I guess I misunderstood you. Well, we have time. We have 15 minutes for Q&A and discussion. I do have a question for each of you, and I'm happy to start that process. Jamal, I found myself very engaged by your sense of a mixed reaction to the religious community and its sometimes complicated response to this pandemic, especially when churches shut down, the denial of communal worship. And I've followed a lot of those incidents over the past several months as people have, kind of rigorously adhered to their desire to join together. And I thought the Bishop of San Francisco had a wonderful editorial in the Washington Post a couple of days ago questioning why certain kinds of businesses like restaurants and bars were permitted to open, but not houses of worship. I thought, I don't know if you've seen that piece, but I thought it expressed a point of view very eloquently. But I also, like you, am concerned about what seems to be, well, I think also some of the criticisms of Luther sound like those criticisms that are launched against those pastors that would like to continue, to have their congregation meet. But I think, like you, concerned about a level of knowledge about how plagues spread, and that Luther didn't have, and which might have obviously tempered his response to his own involvement in caring for plague victims. So I guess all this is to say, I was taken by your idea about acting like a fireman. And I thought, where does that leave those who are gathered to worship? Are they suffocating? Are they fighting the fire, or are they feeding the fire?
Thank you for that. I think it's a good question. I think I was quoting Luther, so these aren't exactly my thoughts in the sense, but I think for using Luther once again, I think if congregations are meeting for worship for the sake of meeting for worship, that is Luther's particular problem. But if they are meeting or they are remaining in a community that is still ravaged by the Black Plague, and they are there to help the effects of the plague, for Luther, that seems to be a sort of form of worship, right? So it's actually very similar to Camus' The Plague, right? Like, why does Dr. Riel stay? Like, he doesn't quite know, but he's committed to staying for the purpose of, you can hear the USD bells, committed to staying for the sake of healing. So I think Martin Luther would actually, in another life, really enjoy the plague in that particular response. So the act of worship is contingent upon the reason for remaining. Now, if it's just we need to remain in worship because bars are open, right? That's usually a popular thing. Like, bars are still open or dispensaries are still open, so why can't the church be open? Then it's not the sort of right theological question, I think, to Luther.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Turner.
I have a question about that, Jamal, because I wonder if there are more complicated set of motivations on the part of people who want to go to church to worship. Because, I mean, in the American context, we think of and talk of worship as very much a form of self-satisfaction and self-gratification. You know, I go there to feel better, you know, I like being with these people and that kind of thing. But I think for many religious believers, they see the gathering of the church and its public worship as an obligation given by God to render him his due, and explicitly commanded in revelation given by God. So I wonder how to balance that value, not simply like what I get out of the worship, but the whole point of worship is not to go to get something out of it, but to give, namely give God his due. How do we balance that against other obligations to protect ourselves and others and that kind of thing? And it seemed like I agreed with you that many of those who thought that God would simply protect them were being presumptuous. That's not faith, that's presumption, right? Faith is the middle ground between despair and presumption. And when you presume that God will perform a perpetual miracle for you and suspend the laws of nature that govern the spreading of viruses, you are presuming. God hasn't promised to do that for anyone. You're presuming on God's generosity there. But I wonder how the duty that many religious believers feel to worship as an act of justice to God plays into that. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that, or Luther's, because you focused very much on the obligations to provide pastoral and spiritual care. And that's, I take it because Luther was defending himself against criticism for having done that. But what about simply the obligations on the church to worship God?
I think that's a really good question. And I think recognizing that the question is more complicated than even American media presents, because most people who are religious are portrayed as being less intelligent than people who are immediately responding in popular ways. So I totally agree with that, which is why I was like, I have to fight my sense of rolling my eyes, because it's a living example of my subject that I study. At the same time, I could even reflect on the Hebrew Bible, like how did they worship in the context of the temple being destroyed, right? So just because I want to give God, or communities want to give God their due, what are some ways to reimagine congregating? What are some ways of reimagining or creatively joining community? I mean, we're still continuing with the Humanities Center as is. So yes, it is a sort of reliance upon technology, but what other means of community do we have? What other utensils and tools do we have to mimic, or at least continue with being in community with one another, that doesn't necessitate us putting each other in danger? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the sort of response that I have is, okay, how have communities, or religious communities, or even any other communities that want to still meet together, how have they reconceptualized doing so that doesn't take away from them thinking that they are giving God God's due, as you put it? So I think that's, sure. Is that helpful?
Oh, it is, absolutely. And I mean, I simply wish that I wish that non-religious people who report on these matters or who talk on these matters did not have such a reductive vision of what religious people are doing, that is not informed at all by how they talk and think about what they are doing. Because to think that the desire to go to church is even akin to the desire to get together with friends at the pub is to lose one of the central values that motivates people to go to church, which is not just because they enjoy it, but because they think they're obligated to do it.
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting though that we're more able now than ever to fulfill those obligations in creative ways. Yeah, it's interesting.
Claire has a question.
Well, it's a comment.
A comment, okay, good.
I mean, we've been talking, or I've been hearing you say that if restaurants can open, why can't churches? Well, they are, but they're meeting outside, spaced apart, and 6 feet from each other, and not breathing at each other, and doing that in the same way that people are allowed to congregate outside restaurants and eat that way. So it's not as if churches are uniquely told you may not gather when other people are beginning to be allowed to gather. In the time when nobody could gather, we did have this notion of, well, okay, we'll gather on Zoom. I mean, if you can't gather any other way, you gather on Zoom. And it seemed a little strange at first, but then a very strong sense of community has built up by meeting people on Zoom. In fact, there's been greater participation, in my church anyway, of being there on Wednesdays at noon or Fridays for a requiem, or as well as Sunday mornings. And there are some who are very nervous about getting infected who will do that now, even though other people are meeting outside and having a service outside. So I think we're making the best of both worlds.
Are those who are meeting outside and those who want to participate on Zoom, has your church found a way to make both live and virtual participations synchronous? Or are they different surfaces for different?
Well, we have 8 and 9 outside, and then at 10 o'clock on Zoom, and then at 11 o'clock coffee hour on Zoom. And there's going to be a blessing of the animals on Zoom, believe it or not, next week. That's on St. Francis Day.
Okay.
I don't know how that's going to work, but they're not allowing cats on there. Just
oh, that's too bad. Thanks, Claire. Mike, I also had a question for you, and I was very interested in the story of the Roman warrior who refused, or who had his varicose veins stripped and worked to suppress any kind of visible, I suppose, display of distress or emotion during that process. And it made me wonder what fortitude is. Is it external? Is it expressed as a lack of reaction that's visible to others? Or is it a total suppression of emotion to the place of denial? And it also struck me that it's obviously resident in the word vir, that it's a manly virtue, it's not a womanly virtue, it's a very patriarchal virtue, and that it presents a kind of a dramatic contrast to today's sort of sense of how you deal with pandemic is to express emotion, not to, and that even, I guess, the healthy expression of emotion is a kind of fortitude. So I wondered if there had been any sort of redefinition of what fortitude means in a more modern context where sharing an inner life with others is considered to be a brave and healthy thing to do.
Yeah, Cynthia, that's a great and really, I think, insightful question. I can say really quickly, one of the reasons I draw that example out, and you're right that, from vir and we get virility and a decidedly masculine sense of fortitude as a certain kind of inner strength, such as to not necessarily like suppress the feeling of pain, but to express what in the Roman times would have been a kind of an unmanly expression of the suffering, of the pain. What interested me about that character as being so effective to Petrarch was just that Petrarch was already involved in his day in doing something that would have appeared to be somewhat unmanly, right? I mean, he's like pouring himself out in these letters about the anguish that he feels about loss of loved ones, to the point where he needs to engage in this kind of quasi-therapeutic endeavor of reading the ancients, right? So that the very fortitude that he sees in Caius Marius, which is a suppression of the expression of intense physical pain, for Petrarch is something that's supposed to be internalized and employed such that he becomes less of a emoter, right, in his own life. And so it's interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought of this as a kind of another way in which a different type of transformation occurs. But Petrarch has done something there with that notion of fortitude. And he's already kind of thinned it out from its kind of more classically polarizingly masculine ways. The other part of your question, I think the more contemporary part that doesn't relate necessarily to Petrarch, having to do with this idea of kind of emotional sharing or story sharing as itself being an act of bravery or courage, I think puts us in a slightly different position. And then you'd want to kind of sort out the difference between fortitude and bravery in those ways. And I haven't given much thought to the difference between those two kind of virtue stances or emotion stances. But I certainly can see in your observation that there is something required of a great deal of strength, if that's what's meant by fortitude, to prompt the bravery to speak about our emotional, psychological challenges during these kinds of times.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that a little bit, I also asked myself the question, is wearing a mask today a lack of fortitude? Is that why it's so despised, especially if we're looking at the classical definition of what fortitude means, which is rooted in a sort of suppression or denial?
If that's what fortitude were to mean, yeah. I mean, I think it is it necessarily, again, I'll just go back and say, I don't think it's necessarily a suppression or a denial, although it is a kind of demonstration of strength so as to minimize the physical expressions, the wailings, as it were, the unmanly wailings, as it were, enduring intense pain. But no, that's a super interesting question. I mean, like, is the wearing of a mask a sign of the absence of fortitude? Is that the question? Yeah. Oh man, you're making me think on my feet, Cynthia.
Well, you're good at
Mike,
it, so good.
How much does Petrarch draw on the classical view of fortitude, which is not about not feeling fear, but about feeling the right amount of fear for the right things, and so on and so forth? I mean, is he thinking of fortitude as not feeling any fear at all?
No. He's thinking of it as a kind of a controlled expression of it, as a manner of controlling it such that it doesn't control you, of controlling grief or pain or anger such that it doesn't control you. So it's quite. I think in that case he's quite in line with the general kind of classical notion of it. If I said otherwise, or the example of Caius Marius communicated otherwise, then I need to go back and revise that.
No, I'm just wondering, because I think many, or at least my impression of many of the people who talk about the wearing of masks as an act of cowardice are acting as if feeling fear and being afraid is incompatible with being courageous. And at least that's not the classical notion of courage, which is to be afraid of the right kinds of things.
Yeah, well,
or acting in the face of fear.
Right. Yeah. I mean, courage is always inclined courage is conceptually bound up with acting in the face of fear. Right. I guess then, Cynthia, your question's making me kind of turn the conversation now to Turner, because I'm not exactly sure that I'd ever been clear about whether or not fortitude and courage were themselves not separate virtue emotion states.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was using the terms interchangeably because I thought you were. Because
I'm going to revise that too.
I think in Latin, so if you say courage, I think fortitudo. If you say fortitude, I think fortitudo. There's only one word in my life, okay? No, I'm not sure, yeah. But I see that you're thinking of fortitude from forti, strength. Yeah, I see your point.
I think we might have time for one more comment. Claire, your blue hand is still in your window. So assuming you have another question or comment you want to.
Can I ask Jamal a question for my own clarification?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
And then we'll hear from Claire, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
A different point of view yet again. I see the wearing of masks in this current situation, at any rate, is obeying St. Paul's dictum that we must obey the authorities who are ordained by God, and our authorities have told us wear a mask, so we wear a mask. Whether we are afraid or not. And I have to say, I live in a retirement community, and there are some people here who are very fearful, who have not left their apartments for 6 months, not left their apartment at all for 6 months. So there's some who are very afraid. And there are some who just have to obey the rules that we've been told to stay in your apartment, you know. So it's a question of the authorities ordained by God.
The absence of a mask is the denial of the social contract.
Yeah.
So those are the terms in which I would put it. But I had another question for both gentlemen who presented today, and it's a general question, and it has to do with a character from Camus' The Plague, the character that I can't forget more than any other, and it's not the central one. And I'm wondering if you have ways of talking about this that would help me. He's the character who, before the plague hit and the city was locked down, he had a lover, I think it's a lover or a young wife, who has had to go to another town to undergo therapy, for physical therapy. And he spends a great deal, I can't remember his name, and I don't have the book in front of me, but he spends the whole novel trying to get out of the city so he can see her. And if the city's in lockdown, it's very, very difficult. He goes through all kinds of things, paying people money, going to wait at places thinking the gates may open, and all of that. And he goes through this excruciating detail of doing that, and how he must see his loved one. And by the end, not at the end, but near the end, he actually has the chance to do it. They've figured it out. They can get him out of there. And at that moment, he does not want to go. And he wants to stay, because all this time he's been working with the doctors to prevent and heal sickness. And he wants to stay with them. He wants to stay with them, and he feels it's a kind of heroism to stay with them. And he does that over and against leaving the place and seeing his loved one. I wonder if either one of you had a way of talking about that. I sensed it a little bit in each of your talks, a little bit. Or is it completely off the table? I don't think it's about the deification of man.
No, I have some things I'd say about that, just as it relates to the novel and having nothing to do with what I said about Petrarch.
Yeah.
Although I did finish with the passage from the novel, but the character Fred is Rambert, right? The journalist.
Yes, that's right.
Right. And so he's an interesting guy, because he's a reflection of a certain way of prioritizing one's own self-interest over the welfare of others, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he begs Ryu to leave, right? And Ryu says to him, look, like, I can't make an exception for you, right? And all Rambert wants out of his, like, kind of, I suppose, like, very short-sighted ethical worldview is to precisely make an exception for himself, right? And so then the reason is, like, why does he want to make an exception? And he says to the doctor, right, like, you have left out the particulars, right? You've left out love. Like, you, Dr. Ryu, think in terms of abstractions, not in terms of concretions, not in terms of persons, not in terms of people who have real lives, who have lovers from whom they've been exiled, right? So then the question is, like, he like, why does he end up staying in the end? And there's that scene, and I mean, Fred, you may have more thoughts on this than I do, but there's that scene where Theroux says to Rambert, right before Rambert is about to leave, he says, like, did you know that that Ryu himself has a wife who's in exile, right? Yeah. He reminds Rambert, and it seems like at that point, like, Rambert kind of transcends himself by realizing that Ryu is not just this kind of, like, cold, calculating medical privileger, right? But he himself actually recognizes that Ryu has transcended his own self-interest in order to do the good.
And in a way, he stays for love. He stays for the love of the suffering.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's coming back to me now. I think so. My particular issue with this character is in the context of Camus' life and commitment. It just contrasts who he was and who he was historically, Camus writes in regards to the Algerian War, Algerian Revolution, I love my mother more than justice. And so I think this character is, many ways, I'll do it this way. This character is aspirational, right? Understanding the context of a particularity and being committed to a sort of calling or a beckoning that is higher than that particular yearning. So he's not trying to leave the town because of something selfish. Like, everyone can understand love. Like, everyone can sympathize with someone wanting to leave that area for that particular reason. And most people have a notion or someone that they love that they'd want to leave the community for. So it's a selfish reason, but it's an understandable selfish reason. So I guess this character is converted to the sort of communal regard and the notion of heroism. And I get it, I understand it, but it's so vastly different from Camus that it kind of pinches a nerve. That's what I'll say about it.
But Jamal, that's a neat point that you make, though. I mean, like, all these characters, like a lot of these characters have these little pieces of Camus in them. And the passage that you mentioned, right? I love my mother more than I love, you know, you can see little bits of Camus in these characters. You know, all five of them have these different reactions to the plague, and how they face it or contend with it. Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't make a vocal character for himself. He spreads that out and so forth.
Yeah, although if we wanted to get a close, Cynthia, if you got to tell us to stop, you should tell us to stop. But Fred, like, the character of Theroux is like really close to Camus, though, right? I mean, it's like he's the one obsessed with like fighting the death penalty, which like was Camus' kind of like primary political form of activism in his life. So yeah, it's an interesting question about which of them are closest to him. It's fun. It's a great
Perhaps
book.
we should have had a panel on Camus as part of this series.
I think maybe Jamal
like.
and I thought each of the other one was going to do Camus, and so decided not to do Camus.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I thought Michael would do Camus, and I did something else.
I did Petrarch. I thought Jamal was going to.
Both your talks reminded me of the book. So.
Well, thank you so much, Michael and Jamal. What a great discussion, and I think a wonderful, fitting ending to what I think's been a very stimulating series. So.